The news of Adanna's episode spread beyond the walls of the school. It reached Solomon's mother swiftly. She was not a woman easily shaken. The weeks after the dibia's son appeared at the school gate passed in uneasy quiet. The guards spoke of it only in murmurs, the students in whispers, but for Adanna, the memory lingered like smoke that would not clear. Still, she buried herself in her books, determined not to falter. It was the season of examinations, and tension gripped the school. Students bent over their desks, pens scratching furiously as invigilators paced the aisles. Adanna was in her element. Questions that left others groaning seemed to unlock themselves beneath her pen. Her teachers often said she was born to shine, that her mind was a lantern in a world too used to darkness. But on the third day of exams, something shifted. The morning assembly had begun as usual. Students stood in neat lines, uniforms crisp, voices lifted in the school anthem. The principal addressed them, his words echoing in the cool air. And then, without warning, Adanna staggered. Her eyes rolled back. Her body convulsed. A wail tore from her lips, not her own voice but something deeper, older, carrying the weight of spirits. Gasps erupted. Students stepped back in fear as Adanna collapsed on the concrete floor, writhing, her limbs stiff as wood. And then she began to speak. The words that spilled from her mouth were strange, guttural, not taught in any classroom. Yet the message was clear enough. She does not belong here. Her path is marked. Return her, or she will not live to see another harvest. The voice was not hers, and yet it came from her. The entire assembly stood frozen, the principal rooted in shock. Teachers rushed forward, trying to hold her, but her strength was wild, unnatural. It took 4 adults to pin her down, her body jerking with a force beyond flesh. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Her body went limp. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The field was silent, save for the thundering of fearful hearts. Adanna woke hours later in the sick bay, her head throbbing, her throat raw. She saw faces peering down at her, the nurse, the principal, teachers whispering among themselves. And standing apart from them all was Solomon, his eyes wide with fear but filled with a stubborn light, as though daring her not to give up. Letters were sent immediately to her parents. By evening, Papa Obi's and Mama F arrived at the school, their faces drawn tight with worry. The principal met them in his office, his tone grave. "Your daughter is gifted," he said, "but something is wrong. This was not ordinary fainting. If this continues, we cannot guarantee her place here. It disrupts the school and endangers her." Mama F broke down in tears. Papa Obi's clenched his fists until the veins stood out, his jaw set in silent war. He knew the dibia's hand was behind this, reaching across distance, clawing at his child's spirit. That night, Adanna's parents slept in the visitors' quarters of the school, too shaken to return home. In the small hours, when the lantern had burned low, Papa Obi sat awake, staring into the darkness. His thoughts turned to the Udala Tree back home, the place where the dibia had struck his staff and claimed his daughter's life. The prophecy was chasing them, refusing to let go. He realized then that the question was no longer whether Adanna could escape. It was whether he could stand firm enough to shield her when fate came to collect. And as dawn broke over the school grounds, Adanna stirred from uneasy dreams, her lips whispering one word over and over, a name that clung to her even in sleep. Solomon! 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 The battle between destiny and desire had fully begun. When the news of Adanna's episode spread beyond the walls of the school, it reached Solomon's mother swiftly. She was not a woman easily shaken. Her life had been one of resilience. She had buried a husband young, raised her only son with stern discipline, and built a thriving boutique that clothed the wealthiest women in the region. She was not one to bow before shrines or prophecies. The next morning, she arrived at the school, her car gleaming beneath the sun. She entered the sick bay where Adanna lay resting, pale and fragile. Her eyes softened at the sight of the girl, but her voice, when she spoke, carried firm authority. "This child does not belong to death," she said. "She belongs to life." She insisted on taking charge of Adanna's care. With the principal's reluctant agreement, she arranged for doctors from the city to examine her. They ran tests, drew blood, listened to her heart. Their verdict was clinical, detached. The fainting spells are caused by a nervous condition, perhaps stress, perhaps malnutrition. They prescribed iron tablets, vitamins, and rest. But Solomon's mother was not content with medicine alone. In the evenings, she gathered Adanna, Solomon, and sometimes even other students willing to join, into her quarters. There, she prayed aloud with the conviction of a woman who believed nothing was greater than the living God. Her voice filled the air like fire, shattering the silence, calling down protection that no staff or shrine could rival. "Every chain that binds this girl," she declared one night, her hands resting firmly on Adanna's trembling shoulders, "is broken in the name above all names. She will live. She will rise. She will fulfill her destiny." Adanna wept quietly through those prayers. She had never been held with such fierce love by anyone outside her family. In those moments, she began to glimpse another kind of strength, one not rooted in tradition or fear, but in faith and choice. The weeks passed. With medicine and prayers, Adanna's fainting spells grew less frequent. Her color returned. She even began to laugh again, her joy soft but steady. Yet the shadow did not vanish completely. Some nights, she still woke trembling, hearing the dibia's son calling her name in her dreams. Sometimes she felt cold winds move through her dormitory, though all the windows were closed. But each time, she clung to the memory of Solomon's mother's hands upon her shoulders, her voice like a shield. And in the daylight, she clung to Solomon's steady presence, his unwavering belief that she was not destined to die, but to live. The dibia's threats still lingered in the village, his son still boasting that Adanna would one day be dragged back. Yet here, in this new world of classrooms and prayers, Adanna began to taste what it meant to resist fate. And for the first time since her life had been spared beneath the Udala tree, she dared to imagine a future where she could truly belong not to death, not to shrines, but to herself. When the term ended, Solomon's mother made a decision that startled everyone. She would not allow Adanna to return to her village immediately. "She is too fragile to be left in that place where fear and superstition are her daily bread," she told the principal firmly. "Let her stay with us for the holiday. In my house she will rest. She will heal." So it was that Adanna left the school not in public transport and taxi like some of the other girls, but seated in the back of Solomon's mother's car, her small box of clothes tucked neatly in the trunk. The journey was like stepping into another life. When they arrived, she saw Solomon's home, wide compound, high gates, flowers blooming where she was used to bare earth. The house itself stood like a promise, of safety, of abundance, of a future she had never dared imagine. Inside, Adanna was treated not as a visitor, but as though she were part of the family. She joined Solomon at the dining table, where food came not from clay pots over firewood, but from gleaming trays and dishes. At night, she lay on a bed so soft it felt like a cloud, the mosquito net tucked carefully around her by the housemaid. Solomon's mother even bought her new dresses, nothing flashy, but fine enough that Adanna sometimes struggled to recognize herself in the mirror. During the day, she often accompanied Solomon's mother to her boutique in the bustling city market. The boutique was unlike anything Adanna had ever seen. Shelves lined with shimmering lace, polished glass counters stacked with coral beads and gold bangles, women from wealthy families sweeping in with their escorts to buy fabrics worth more than her father's yearly harvest. Solomon's mother trusted Adanna with small tasks, arranging fabrics, handing customers items, recording small notes in a ledger. Adanna marveled at the trust, the rhythm, the dignity of it. In those moments, she imagined what her life could be if she, too, had the chance to belong to such a world. Evenings were softer. After dinner, she sat with Solomon in the sitting room, reading books together or watching television programs that made her laugh in ways she hadn't laughed in years. Sometimes they quarreled playfully over the stories in his novels. Sometimes they leaned in, lost in the glow of the screen. For Adanna, these evenings felt like stolen treasures, simple, ordinary moments, yet so extraordinary compared to the shadowed life she had always known. And for the first time in many years, she moved through days without the constant weight of fear. But while Adanna tasted this fragile joy, in the village the shadows stirred. The dibia had not forgotten. His pride had been wounded. Not only had the girl slipped from his grip, but now word spread that she was living in wealth and comfort, far from the fate he had declared for her. Whispers began to circle the marketplace. The spirit child had defied her covenant, and the dibia would not let such rebellion go unpunished. One night, beneath a thin crescent moon, calamity struck. Papa Obi's goats were found dead in their pen, their bodies stiff as though strangled by invisible hands. The next day, Mama Obi's Gary bags, stacked neatly in the store, were ruined, the grains swollen and black as though soaked in unseen waters. Soon after, the family's youngest son fell ill with a fever that no herbs could cure, his cries piercing the night. Fear spread like wildfire. Neighbors shook their heads in pity, whispering that the dibia had loosed his anger upon them. Some advised Papa Obis to surrender, to take his daughter back and seal her marriage to the dibia's son before more ruin came. Others said nothing at all, afraid to be caught in the crossfire of spirits. But in the safety of Solomon's home, Adanna knew nothing of this, at least not yet. For her, the days of holiday life still flowed like a dream she did not want to wake from. What she did not know was that the price of her happiness was being paid in the suffering of her family back in the village. And sooner or later, that knowledge would reach her, dragging her heart once again between two worlds, the life she longed for and the life that still claimed her blood. The holiday at Solomon's home was like sunlight after a storm. Adanna moved through days of ease, helping in the boutique, reading beside Solomon, kneeling in prayer with his mother. She felt herself growing stronger, lighter, almost whole. But even in her laughter, a shadow sometimes crossed her heart, a shadow that came from her village, where she knew trouble must be stirring. That shadow finally reached her one evening. A relative from the village arrived at Solomon's compound, his face drawn with sorrow. He carried news. The dibia had struck her family. Goats dead, food ruined, her little brother fevered and weak. The message was clear, the spirits were demanding her return. Adanna wept bitterly, her joy collapsing beneath the weight of guilt. She wanted to run back to her family, to surrender herself so their suffering might cease. But Solomon's mother gathered her firmly in her arms. "Listen to me, child," she said, her voice steady. "You do not belong to that shrine. You are not chained to that man. Life is not a debt you must pay with marriage. Life is a gift, and you must live it." Her words settled in Adanna's heart like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples through all her fears. For the first time, she began to believe that perhaps the dibia's power was not final, that there was another path. So they returned to the village, not in fear, but in defiance. Solomon's mother came with them, Bible in hand, her presence a shield. When they reached the compound, the dibia and his son were waiting, surrounded by villagers eager to see if the spirit child would finally be reclaimed. But Papa Obi stood tall. He declared that his daughter would not be given to the dibia's son. She had won a scholarship, she had found healing, and she would live to fulfill her destiny. The villagers murmured, shocked by his courage. The dibia tried to curse them, but Solomon's mother raised her voice in prayer, and the air seemed to tremble with power. The dibia faltered, his words breaking on his lips. That night, for the first time, no dark wind swept through the compound. The fever that gripped Adanna's little brother broke before dawn, leaving him breathing softly in his mother's arms. Days later, whispers began to move through the village. The dibia had fallen ill. Some said it was a mysterious sickness that wasted him from the inside. Others claimed he had been struck by a curse for raising his hand against an innocent child. A few, more cautious, muttered that it was simply the toll of old age. Whatever the reason, the once feared dibia weakened, withered, and at last died. The villagers stood divided in their whispers, some afraid, some relieved, but all aware that something had shifted. The shadow that had hung over them for so long had lifted. The dibia's son, stripped of his father's power, could no longer boast or threaten. The fear that had chained them was broken, and Adanna, no longer the fragile girl who fainted at every turn, began to walk with her head held high. Under the shade of the old Udala tree, she made a vow to herself: she would live. She would study, she would grow, she would become more than the story the dibia had written for her. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, one truth had become clear: her life was her own. Not the dibia's, not death's, hers.